April 8, 1944, RAF Halesworth, England. The wind, coming off the North Sea, carried the scent of spring rain and the distant rumble of engines. On the dispersal pads, rows of P-47 Thunderbolts gleamed under a weak sun, each aircraft marked by months of hard flying. Their once shiny aluminum skins were dulled by oil streaks and cordite stains. Names painted on their noses spoke of home: Little Chief, Sleepy Time Gal, Miss Fire, Ohio Express. Major Hubert Hub Zemke walked the line, coffee steaming in his hand, his eyes scanning every detail. To the ground crews, he seemed incapable of rest. Every oil leak, every loose cowling latch caught his attention. To him, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a machine, it was the instrument of victory. The embodiment of American industrial power given wings. Since that first disastrous spring of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had become the deadliest unit in the 8th Air Force. Zemke's Wolfpack, the newspapers called them. In a single year, they had destroyed over 500 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. German intelligence had taken to calling them the Steel Storm, a phrase that spread among Luftwaffe pilots like a whispered curse. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt had transformed from high-altitude escort to all-purpose predator. The new P-47 D-22 and D-23 models, with paddle blade props and water injection engines, had erased the last German advantages. Climb, acceleration, dive, and durability all belong now to the Americans. But even as the fighters' power grew, so too did the scale of the air war. The daylight bombing campaign had reached its decisive phase. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, and Hanover had been followed by Berlin itself. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators streamed daily across the Channel, and above them the Thunderbolts flew guard. It was a new kind of air war, not duels between knights, but industrial slaughter. Pilots learned to navigate through seas of contrails and burning debris, to watch for the black puffs of flak that blossomed like malignant flowers in the thin blue air. On February 20th, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, soon to be known as Big Week. For 7 consecutive days, the skies over Germany were filled with smoke and flame. The 8th Air Force struck the aircraft factories of Leipzig, Gotha, and Regensburg, while the 15th Air Force hit targets from Italy. The Luftwaffe, drawn up to defend its lifeblood industries, suffered crippling losses. At Halesworth, Zemke briefed his pilots before dawn on the 3rd day. The mapboard behind him was studded with colored pins, marking routes, altitudes, and rally points. "Gentlemen," he said, "today the war changes. We're not just protecting bombers anymore. We're going to break the back of the Luftwaffe." He traced a line eastward from the Channel to Brunswick. "We'll sweep ahead of the bombers and hit anything with a cross on it. If you see an airfield, strafe it. If you see trucks, trains, even horses, burn them. You are to leave nothing behind that can fight tomorrow." The men nodded silently. They knew what that meant. The old dogfights of 1943, chivalric, personal, were over. From now on, it was extermination. At 24,000 feet over western Germany, Zemke's Wolfpack met the enemy. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had: Focke-Wulf 190As, Messerschmitt 109Gs, twin-engined Zerstörer squadrons desperate to break through to the bombers. But the Americans no longer fought on German terms. They used altitude and momentum like hammers. They came from above, unseen, invisible until the tracers reached their mark. Captain Robert Johnson, already an ace, dove from 30,000 feet on a formation of 190s climbing from below. He fired a 2-second burst. One German disintegrated instantly. Another rolled over trailing smoke. Johnson pulled up into the vertical, feeling the weight of gravity and the scream of the supercharger behind him. When he leveled out again, his guns were empty, but the sky below him was littered with black specks, parachutes, burning aircraft, pieces of wings tumbling end over end. That week, the Thunderbolt pilots destroyed more than 300 enemy aircraft for the loss of 28 of their own. The Luftwaffe never recovered. Its ranks of veteran aces, men who had survived since Poland and France, were decimated. In their place came green replacements, barely trained, many with fewer than 20 flight hours in a combat aircraft. The sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Americans. By March 1944, the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in England. Sleeker, longer-ranged and faster at altitude, they soon became the primary bomber escort. But the Thunderbolt was far from obsolete. It had found a new role. The low-altitude destroyer, the iron fist of the 9th Air Force. The shift began quietly. Zemke's men began receiving orders to strafe rail lines and convoys, instead of climbing to 30,000 feet. Their 500 lb bombs and rocket rails turned the P-47 into a tactical weapon of terrifying effectiveness. By summer, the Jug, as its pilots affectionately called it, had become the scourge of German ground forces. With invasion imminent, the Allied command needed an aircraft that could survive flak, dive from altitude, and obliterate targets with machine guns and ordnance. The Thunderbolt was built for exactly that. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before dawn, the first Thunderbolts of the 365th and 366th Fighter Groups crossed the Normandy beaches. Their task, destroy anything that moved behind the German lines. In the mist-filled dawn, they found convoys, trains and columns of armor moving toward the coast. The first rocket salvo streaked into a line of Panzer V's near St. Lo. The explosion tossed one tank into the air like a toy. The radio crackled with shouts and laughter. "That's for London." By noon, the air above Normandy was an American domain. Luftwaffe resistance had collapsed into scattered, desperate attacks by small groups of FW-190s. Most never even reached the beaches. Allied radar and constant fighter patrols turned every German sortie into suicide. For the soldiers fighting on the ground, the Thunderbolt became a guardian angel. Its engine note, deep, throaty, unmistakable, was a sound that meant survival. To German troops, it was the sound of doom. Reports from the Wehrmacht's 2nd Panzer Division after D-Day spoke of continuous attacks by J-Bos, fighter bombers, with rockets and bombs that made movement by day impossible. The Thunderbolt had evolved into the perfect tactical weapon. Its radial engine could take a direct hit from 20 min flak and keep running. Its rugged airframe shrugged off shrapnel and small arms fire. And its 8 50 caliber Brownings, combined with bombs and rockets, gave it the destructive capacity of a light bomber. By late June, the 362nd Fighter Group alone had destroyed over 500 vehicles and 75 locomotives in 2 weeks. Pilots learned to recognize the flash of enemy gunfire through their armored windshields, to pull up only when trees filled the canopy, to fly so low that the slipstream bent the grass. But the war was changing again. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and surged across France, the Luftwaffe withered. Its once mighty fighter arm now relied on fuel-starved aircraft and hastily trained youths. American pilots noticed that many German planes simply refused combat, diving away or disappearing into cloud at the first sight of opposition. Still, the Thunderbolt pilots paid in blood. Flak, not fighters, became their deadliest enemy. Columns of black bursts filled the sky around bridges, rail yards, and crossroads. The odds of returning from a low-level strike were worse than from a dogfight. But the men flew anyway, day after day, until the sound of the big radial engine became part of their heartbeat. Autumn 1944. Belgium. The 365th Fighter Group operated from hastily built airstrips carved out of farmland. Mud splattered the undersides of their aircraft. The war had moved east, toward the Rhine. Each morning, ground crews loaded bombs and ammunition under cold rain. Pilots briefed in tents that smelled of gasoline and wet canvas. Major Glenn Eagleston, a quiet man with a 1,000-yard stare, led his squadron across the German frontier. "If it moves, kill it," he told his men. They did. Rail yards in Koblenz, convoys near Aachen, flak towers outside Cologne. Nothing escaped the Thunderbolt's fury. By this time, The Luftwaffe's last hope lay in desperation weapons. The jet-powered Me-262 and rocket-powered Me-163. When these appeared, they stunned the Allies with their speed. But their numbers were too few, their pilots too inexperienced. In the hands of veterans like Adolf Galland or Walter Nowotny, the jets scored impressive kills, but they could not alter the outcome. In December 1944, the Germans launched their final great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. For days, bad weather grounded the Allied air forces. The Thunderbolt pilots waited in frustration as German armored columns smashed through the Ardennes. But on December 23rd, the clouds broke. At dawn, the jugs roared into the skies, swarming over the snow-covered forests. What followed was annihilation. Convoys, bridges, and fuel dumps erupted in fire. The 365th and 366th Fighter Groups alone destroyed more than 600 vehicles in 3 days. German soldiers, trapped in the snow and ice, learned to fear the sunlight, for it meant the Thunderbolts would return. A captured German diary found near Bastogne read simply, "The Jabo comes. Everything burns. We cannot move. God help us." As 1945 began, the Thunderbolt had become synonymous with destruction. In the words of General Karl Spaatz, it broke the German army's spine. The air war that had begun as a contest of skill between aces had ended as industrialized annihilation. By March, the Rhine was crossed. The sky above Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Every road, rail line, and airfield lay under constant attack. Thunderbolts prowled the countryside at treetop height, hunting anything that moved. Trains exploded, trucks burned, columns of smoke marked the front lines from horizon to horizon. And still, the German pilots fought. Young men, many barely out of flight school, climbed into their Bf-109Gs and FW-190Ds, knowing they would not return. They flew because duty demanded it, because someone had to stand against the storm. One of them was Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Merton, age 19, of JG-26, the same wing that had once laughed at the flying milk bottles. On April 8, 1945, exactly 2 years to the day since Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachine had mocked the first Thunderbolts over France, Merton scrambled from a field near Hanover to intercept a formation of American fighter bombers. He never saw them. A flight of P-47Ms, the final high-performance variant capable of 475 Nm, spotted his takeoff. Before his wheels left the ground, 8 50-caliber guns tore across the strip. The 109 exploded in a cloud of flame. The pilot never had a chance. That day, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. April 25, 1945, near Munich. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, now America's leading ace in Europe, led a final sweep ahead of the advancing U.S. Army. Below, the ruins of the Reich unfolded like a shattered machine. Towns smoldered, roads were choked with refugees. The smoke of 1,000 fires drifted across the Alps. Gabreski looked down from 15,000 feet at a country that had once challenged the world. "We didn't just beat them," he told his wingman over the radio. "We buried them." His formation dove one last time, 8 Thunderbolts dropping through thin white clouds, guns flashing, engines roaring like thunder. A train exploded on a curve near Augsburg. Black smoke billowed upward, the final punctuation mark on 2 years of relentless vengeance. When they landed, the ground crewmen came out to meet them, but the cheers were quiet now. The war was ending. The laughter, the bravado, the swagger, all had been spent. The men who stepped down from the cockpits were older than their years, their faces lined by wind, oil, and memory. In the months that followed, historians and engineers would analyze what had happened, how a plane once mocked as a milk bottle had become the most feared aircraft in Europe. The answer lay not just in horsepower or armor, but in philosophy. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented the triumph of endurance over elegance, of mass over maneuver. It was the child of factories, not of duels. Where the Germans had built perfect weapons for perfect pilots, The Americans had built a machine that could make every pilot effective, every sortie survivable. It could be flown by a farm boy from Oklahoma or a city kid from Chicago, and it would bring them home. By war's end, Thunderbolts had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties, dropped 130,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed 86,000 vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored units. Over 3,500 enemy aircraft had fallen to their guns. They had rewritten the Book of Air Power and buried the Luftwaffe beneath its pages. Epilogue. Summer 1945. Bridgeport, Connecticut. Alexander Kartveli stood outside the Republic Aviation hangar, watching the sunset glint off a row of P-47s bound for the Pacific. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were bright with pride. A young engineer beside him said quietly, "You built the biggest fighter in the world." Kartveli smiled faintly. "No," he said. "We built the strongest." The last light of day caught the Thunderbolt's wings, broad, unbending, powerful. As they lifted into the orange sky, they had come a long way from that April morning over France, when German pilots had laughed at their size and shape. The laughter had died long ago, replaced by silence and smoke. In the end, the sound that remained was the deep, relentless roar of a Pratt & Whitney double wasp, the sound of a machine that changed the war, and in doing so, changed the world. Autumn 1945, Le Bourget Airfield, Paris. The war in Europe was over. On the tarmac of the newly liberated French capital, the air no longer thundered with engines and gunfire, but with the quieter sounds of peace, the rattle of fuel trucks, the echo of boots on concrete, the distant laughter of soldiers going home. Lined along the perimeter were aircraft that had carried the war from Normandy to the Rhine, P-51 Mustangs, Typhoons, Spitfires, and, towering above them all, the unmistakable bulk of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. French mechanics moved reverently among them. The aircraft had been handed over to the new Armée de l'Air, part of the vast surplus the Americans were leaving behind. Many bore the faded nose art of their previous owners: Mary Jane II, Texas Belle, Lucky 7, the names of boys who had gone home, or who never would. Colonel Jean-Marie Accart, one of France's few surviving pre-war aces, climbed the ladder into a cockpit still smelling of cordite and oil. He had flown Dewoitine D-520s in 1940, Spitfires with the RAF in 1941, and now, for the first time, he sat in an American monster. "It's not beautiful," he said softly, running his gloved hand along the armored cowling. "But perhaps beauty no longer wins wars." When he advanced the throttle, the double wasp roared to life, 18 cylinders in perfect synchronized fury. The ground shook. Men stopped what they were doing to watch, as the old ace lifted the Thunderbolt into the pale autumn sky. It climbed like a cathedral rising on fire. Below, someone murmured, "The war's over, but the sound of that engine will never leave us." Winter 1946, Schweinfurt, Germany. Among the ruins of the city that had once supplied half of the Reich's ball bearings, engineers from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey picked their way through twisted steel and ash. The devastation was total. They were there to measure, to count, to calculate what the air war had achieved. But even amid the rubble, one fact was already clear. The theory of air power had been proven beyond argument. On a battered wall, scrawled in charcoal by some anonymous hand, were the words, "Hier war die Luftwaffe." Here was the Luftwaffe. One of the survey officers, a young major from Kansas who had flown Thunderbolts with the 78th Fighter Group, stood silently for a long moment. His name was James R. Doolan, and in his mind, he could still see it all: the black smoke over Brunswick, the spinning silver contrails, the streak of tracers slicing through cloud. He turned to his notebook and wrote a single line: "We didn't win the war in the air because we were better pilots. We won because we built machines that could not be killed." 1947, Farmingdale, Long Island. The Republic Aviation Plant, once the beating heart of America's fighter production, stood quiet. The assembly lines where thousands of men and women had once worked night and day were silent now, the machines covered in dust. But in one hangar light still burned. Alexander Kartveli had not stopped designing. The P-47 had been a masterpiece of its age, but he saw clearly that a new age had already begun. Jets were the future. On his drafting table lay blueprints for a sleek, thin-winged aircraft with a single massive turbojet engine. It would become the F-84 Thunderjet, the spiritual descendant of the Jug. When journalists visited him that spring, Kartveli spoke softly of what had been and what was to come. "The Thunderbolt was built to win one war," he said. "Now we must build to prevent the next." Yet even as he worked, the legacy of the P-47 continued to grow. Hundreds were sent to allied nations, to France, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey. In South America they roared over jungles and mountains, symbols of modern power. In China and the Philippines they became guardians against new threats. Wherever they flew, people remembered their sound, the deep, hammering voice of freedom in flight. 48. Korea. Pyongyang. When the Korean peninsula erupted in war 2 years later, few believed the old Thunderbolts would ever fight again. By then, jets ruled the skies. The F-80 Shooting Star, the F-86 Sabre. But on the first days of the conflict, when the UN forces were driven south and airfields were scarce, it was the rugged P-47s of the South Korean Air Force, leftovers from the Pacific, that struck the first blows. Their radial engines howled once more over mountain valleys, their bombs falling on advancing armored columns just as they had over Normandy. Old American pilots, now instructors and advisors, watched with quiet pride. The Jug still lived, indestructible, unforgotten 1950s, a new age. As the jet age matured, the P-47 became a memory, then a legend. Many were scrapped, their metal melted down to feed a peacetime economy. Some were sold for pennies, stripped of guns and armor, their cockpits gathering dust in barns and hangars, but a few survived. At air shows, grey-haired veterans would gather to watch one start up, the propeller beginning to turn, slow at first, then faster, until the deep growl of the double wasp filled the air once again. For a moment they were young again, back over France, over the Ardennes, chasing black crosses through cloud. One of them was Robert S. Johnson. In 1955, at an exhibition in Oklahoma, he stood beside the restored Lucky Little Lady, a P-47D painted in his wartime colors. Reporters asked him what he felt hearing that engine again. He smiled faintly. "I feel alive," he said. "That sound brought me home when everything else failed." The crowd fell silent as the old machine taxied out. When it lifted off the runway, the ground shook as it always had. For an instant, the sky seemed to remember 1960s, Germany again. 2 decades after the war, a young Luftwaffe lieutenant named Klaus Weber walked through the museum at Gatow near Berlin. His father had flown with JG-26, the famed Abbeville boys. On the wall hung photographs of grinning German aces beside their FW-190s. Beneath them stood the hulking shape of a P-47, silver and immense, with the star and bar still painted on its wings. He stopped before it, staring up at the broad fuselage, the thick armor around the engine cowling. There was no mockery in his eyes now, only quiet respect. He reached out and touched the cold metal. A curator nearby said, "That one was found near Cologne. Crashed, but the pilot survived." Walked away from it. Weber nodded slowly. "I believe it," he said. For him, the Thunderbolt was more than an enemy machine. It was a monument to endurance, proof that even in destruction, something could remain unbroken. 70s, Farmingdale again. Republic Aviation was gone, merged into larger corporations, its name a fading echo. But in one corner of the old plant, a group of volunteers worked to restore a single P-47D from scrap. They were engineers, veterans, sons and grandsons of men who had built them the first time. They called her Snafu 2, When the engine finally turned over, the sound filled the hangar like a ghost returning home. Oil smoke swirled, tools clattered to the floor, and every man there stopped what he was doing. One of them, an old mechanic named Joe Santini, wiped his hands and whispered, "God, I missed that sound." The aircraft flew again in 1977. As it climbed into the sky over Long Island, crowds lined the runways. Among them was an elderly Alexander Kartveli, frail, walking with a cane. He watched silently as his creation rose once more. Tears blurred his vision. "Still strong," he murmured. "Still free." 1990s, Duxford, England, at an air show commemorating the 50th anniversary of D-Day. The last surviving P-47s flew in formation, 3 great silver beasts thundering across a blue summer sky. Below, veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms faded, their memories sharp as ever. One of them, a British pilot who had once mocked the American milk bottles, turned to a younger man beside him and said, "We used to laugh at those things, you know. Said they were too heavy, too ugly to fight." He paused as the sound rolled over them, deep, commanding, eternal. But they outlasted us all. Present day, Thunderbolt Park, Oklahoma. A bronze statue stands beside a restored P-47D, its wings gleaming in the sun. The inscription reads, "They were heavy, they were loud, they were indestructible. They carried us home." School children walked past, their teachers telling them about the air war over Europe, about courage and industry, about how machines can become symbols of human will. In the distance, a modern F-35 streaks across the sky, sleek and silent, but for a moment as the wind shifts, one can almost hear the echo of another sound, the deep, rhythmic thunder of a double wasp climbing through cloud. The story of the Thunderbolt is not just the story of an airplane. It is the story of transformation, of laughter turned to fear, of weakness turned to strength, of men who learned that survival itself could be victory, from the cold skies over France to the quiet museums of peace. Its legacy endures, a machine too heavy to fly, too slow to turn, too stubborn to die. A machine that proved the impossible could not only rise, it could win. And when the last of them finally falls silent, when the last veteran closes his eyes and the last hangar door shuts, the sound will remain, faint, distant, eternal, the echo of thunder. The Juggernaut Ascends, Part 4. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Western Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, had become the hunted. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that ungainly, overweight brute the Germans once mocked, now ruled the high altitudes with impunity. Its deep roar became the soundtrack of every bomber stream crossing into occupied Europe. Each formation of B-17s and B-24s was now escorted by a phalanx of these jugs, their silver wings glinting in the sun. To German ground troops and rail convoys, the distant growl of radial engines meant only one thing: death was coming from above. The introduction of drop tanks, especially the 150-gallon paper shell variety, transformed the Thunderbolt's reach. What had once been a defensive escort fighter bound to the coast of France now struck deep into the Reich. American planners called it the long arm of the 8th Air Force. Major David Schilling and Colonel Hubb. Zemke pioneered the fighter sweep, sending P-47s ahead of bomber formations to clear the skies. They didn't wait for the enemy anymore. They hunted. And the Luftwaffe, bled by years of attrition, found itself overwhelmed by an enemy it could no longer outfly, outshoot, or outlast. The Luftwaffe's desperation by early 1944. German pilots entering combat faced an impossible arithmetic. Each Thunderbolt they encountered was supported by a production line that could replace losses 10 times faster than Germany's battered industry. Allied factories rolled out P-47s by the thousands, 15 new aircraft every day. Training standards on the German side plummeted. Once, it had taken a Luftwaffe pilot 240 flight hours before combat. By mid-1944, replacements were being thrown into battle with barely 80. The skies over Europe had become an aerial meat grinder. And the Thunderbolt was one of its sharpest blades, Oberleutnant Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer. Germany's top night fighter ace later admitted to an Allied interrogator after the war, "We did not fear the bombers. We feared their guards. The Thunderbolts had no fear, and their firepower was unimaginable. You could not dive away. You could not climb. You could only pray you were not the one they chose." Even the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, the Luftwaffe's last hope, could not fully counter the Jug's dominance. When jets did appear, Thunderbolt pilots learned to attack them as they landed, catching them vulnerable during takeoff or approach. "Let them have the sky," one P-47 pilot said. "We'll own the ground they take off from." The ground attack revolution, as bomber escort duties gradually passed to the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang, the Thunderbolt found a new role, one perfectly suited to its brutish strength. It became the most feared ground attack aircraft in Western Europe. Armed with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, the P-47 evolved into a flying sledgehammer. Its thick armor and rugged radial engine allowed it to shrug off ground fire that would have shredded any other fighter. In preparation for the D-Day invasion, Thunderbolt groups roamed across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, systematically erasing the German transport network. Rail lines vanished. Locomotives exploded in sprays of steam and shrapnel. Trucks burned on every highway. The Germans began calling it Der Schlachthammer, the battle hammer. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed ashore at Normandy, Thunderbolts screamed overhead in endless rotations. They flew 2,000 sorties that day, pounding German artillery positions, strafing columns, and shielding the beachheads from counterattack. The combination of precision and brute force was devastating. One Luftwaffe field report from the 21st Panzer Division described the effect bluntly: "We move only at night. In daylight, the sky belongs to the Americans." The legend of Zemke's. Wolfpack no unit embodied the Thunderbolt spirit more than the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack. Under the command of Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, the group perfected tactics that maximized the P-47's strengths. They fought in disciplined formations, struck in vertical dives, and always maintained altitude advantage. By the end of 1944, the Wolfpack had claimed over 665 aerial victories, more than any other P-47 group in Europe. Their ranks included Gabreski, Johnson, Schilling, and many other names etched into the legend of American air power. Gabby Gabreski himself was shot down in July 1944 after strafing an airfield too low, his final act of aggression before capture. Before that day, he had become the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater. When asked what made the Thunderbolt so deadly, his answer was simple: she could dive, she could shoot, and she could take it. That's all a fighter needs. Across France and into Germany, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy, Thunderbolts became a constant presence above the advancing armies. They operated from makeshift airstrips carved out of French fields, sometimes only miles behind the front. Ground crews slept in tents, refueled with jerry cans, and patched bullet holes with sheet metal. But the sorties never stopped. Each mission pushed deeper into German territory. Bridges destroyed, trains derailed, armor columns smashed to fragments. The P-47's 2,000 horsepower engine could carry it through almost anything. One famous photograph shows a Thunderbolt returning to base with half its rudder missing, holes punched clean through its fuselage, and an entire cylinder head gone from the radial engine. The pilot landed safely. By late 1944, Luftwaffe resistance over France and the Low Countries had effectively ceased. The once proud Jägerschwader were shadows of their former selves, manned by exhausted veterans and terrified boys. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, just kept getting better, faster, heavier, deadlier. The P-47D-25 and later bubble canopy versions offered superb visibility and additional payload capacity. The Thunderbolt was now carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs, nearly as much as a medium bomber of 1940. The final storm. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the weather turned the skies of Europe into a grey cauldron of snow and smoke. For days, Allied aircraft were grounded. When the clouds finally lifted, the Thunderbolts rose in fury. They struck German columns caught in the open, tanks, half-tracks and convoys trying to resupply the Ardennes offensive. In one 3-day span, P-47 groups destroyed more than 2,500 vehicles. German tank crews came to dread the distinctive shriek of diving Thunderbolts and the thunderclap of their rockets. Survivors described the sound as the voice of doom. Even Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's famed general of fighters, later wrote, "The Thunderbolt was not elegant, but it was relentless." It symbolized the American way of war, massive, direct, and unstoppable. Victory and aftermath by April 1945, the skies over Germany were an American domain. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, barely existed. Thunderbolts now roamed freely from the Rhine to Berlin, blasting anything that moved. When Germany finally surrendered, the P-47 stood as one of the most successful fighter designs in history, over 15 to 600 built, serving not only with the US but with France, Britain, and later dozens of nations around the world. It had begun as a joke, a flying milk bottle, and ended as the iron hammer of Allied victory. In the years after the war, the Thunderbolt continued to serve in Korea, Latin America, and even the early days of NATO. But in Europe, where its legend was born, its rumbling engine became a memory, a symbol of courage, power, and industrial might fused into one machine. Epilogue. When modern pilots see the restored P-47s at air shows, gleaming in polished aluminum, they often remark how enormous it looks compared to a Mustang or Spitfire. But that size carried something else, a message. It said that victory would not come from grace or beauty, but from endurance, persistence, and overwhelming strength. The Thunderbolt didn't win through elegance. It won through power, and through the men who trusted their lives to its armor and fire. In a war defined by machines, it proved that heart and steel could still beat genius and fear. And as the last P-47 climbs into the blue, its radial engine echoing across time, one truth remains. The Jug was never meant to be loved, but it became impossible to forget.